And many of you know Maysam, but just in case, I'm going to say a few words. Maysam is a Palestinian educator, grassroots organizer, and poet based in Toronto. Currently, she supports the work of Anishinaabe-Palestine Alliance and is committed to joint struggle in practice and relationship. Her poetry has been featured in the Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Anthology and the International Palestine Rights Festival. Maysam was the lead artist on a multimedia poetry project titled Revolution Must Mean Life, exploring the intersections of Palestine and the labor movement as part of the Mayworks Festival of Working People and the Arts. And I'm especially excited to say that. I'm one of the boards, I'm on the board. So we always love Maysam's work. In her research, she is interested in the intersections of counterinsurgency, cultural resistance, popular poetry, and popular education rooted in the long lineage of Palestinian resistance culture. As a secondary school teacher and workshop facilitator, Maysam is committed to co-creating critical learning communities with young people. And with that, I will invite Maysam to join us on stage.
So much, Pam. It's an honor to be here today and to be able to moderate this next session with you all. I get the pleasure and the honor of being able to introduce our esteemed speakers for today. First off being Adnan Husain, who is a professor of medieval, Mediterranean, and Islamic world history at Queen's University. My welcome. Currently focusing on the Crusades and the Crusader states as a foundational history for Western imperialism and settler colonialism today. He is the host of 2 anti-imperialist podcasts, highly recommend, Guerrilla History Podcast and the Adnan Husain Show. So please give a warm welcome for Adnan. Joining us virtually is, of course, Ilan Pappé, who is a renowned historian and professor at the University of Exeter, as well as the co-director of the university's European Center for Palestinian Studies. His research focuses on the modern Middle East, and in particular, the history of Palestine and the Zionist entity. He has also written on multiculturalism, critical discourse analysis, and on power and knowledge. So please give a warm welcome to Ilan. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, we've got Patrick Higgins, who is a historian of West Asia and the Middle East, and the co-editor of Liberated Texts and a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. So please give a warm welcome to Patrick. Are traveling in from Toronto. Patrick, you came in from Houston, if I'm not mistaken, and Adnan from the far lands of Kingston, Ontario. So we really appreciate you both making it today. We really appreciate Ilan, you making it with us here. We know it's evening time for you as well, and so we're glad you're sharing your time with us. So we know that we are in a critical moment for empire, right? We have witnessed over 2.5 years of resistance and genocidal escalation in Gaza and across Palestine, and now across the entirety of the region with the invasion of Lebanon and the ongoing US Zionist war on Iran. We're also witnessing the impact of the US's cruel economic and fuel blockade on the Cuban people, the kidnapping of political leaders of sovereign nations in places like Venezuela, and the ongoing grassroots resistance efforts of people like the Sudanese people in the face of counter-revolutionary forces, among so many other examples, right? And so we know that as students of revolutionary struggle, it's important for us in moments like these to come back to history. And so when we talk about empire, we're going to spend some time, I think the majority of this conversation, unpacking what we mean when we talk about empire. And I'm going to ask the three of you to describe the historic and present-day contours of empire and exactly what we mean when we talk about imperialism as a global system. And perhaps we can start with you, Adnan, if you can give us an overview.
Well, thanks so much, Maysam, for the introduction, for the organizers for inviting me, to all of you for coming, and my fellow panelists for what I hope will be a really interesting and important conversation that I think, being able to identify and understand what we mean by empire and the operations of imperialism are, absolutely crucial, if we are to resist it and defeat it. So that's the way in which I take the value and importance of this conversation. It's less an academic kind of definition of empire than an appreciation of how we can resist and defeat it. And whatever we call it, there's a lot of ways now of referring to it. I've become fond of calling it the Epstein Empire for the sake of, exploiting the contemporary conditions of the way in which it isn't, US or Israel or just a kind of vague sense of the elites, but in fact actually a whole network that is tied in to deep state structures, to corporations and finance, big tech, and the way it operates across territories, right, in ways that are very difficult. And what Maysam just started with by, acknowledging, we've got blockade on Cuba, kidnapping of the sovereign leader in Venezuela by the US, 2.5 years of intense genocide following the historic genocide on Palestine, now imperialist war on Iran. It can be really dizzying to keep track of these multiple theaters and how they fit together, and how to have a kind of coherent analysis of what's going on when every day it seems like years of news has taken place. So what I wanted to say is that I think it's very important as a medieval historian, pre-modern historian, to take a longue durée perspective on understanding a couple of important distinctions and differences. One is the political category of empire, historically, what that has meant, versus imperialism today, and its more systemic global system that is operating, just as I mentioned, across very different kind of territories at different sorts of levels. And so what I want to say is that there's an important distinction to be made between the old historic empires as a political form and modern nation-state colonizing empires, something very different that happens more recently in the history of the world. That is what is behind the construction of a world system based on imperialism. And so, just generally, empires were just large-scale, political entities that involved many different peoples being subordinate to one political power, usually a dynasty. If we think, relevant to today's moment, the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Great, that was a very cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious, multicultural political empire that had a universalist sort of scope in some ways and incorporated all these different peoples. But what it wasn't was a unifying force for trying to impose an ethno-nationalist identity, a particular religious identity that its citizens or subjects, because they weren't citizens, its subjects had to adhere to. It could accommodate these diverse, different cultures, traditions, as long as they were loyal and paid their taxes to the sovereign overlord. So it's a particular kind of political formation, not the one we want to have in our world today necessarily. It's not what we are fighting for, but it's very different from what comes later. And so since the Achaemenid Empire, through the Abbasid Empire in Islamic lands, to the Ottomans, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all these were older land-based polities that involved multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic peoples, right? What has happened, I would say, in the last 500 years or so is the development of new settler colonial societies and colonial possessions that were based on the consolidation of nation states that defined political community in a particular exclusivist way, and then exported this violence and conquest to subordinate others who could not be tolerated to participate at the upper levels of decision-making, rulership, etc., which isn't the way in which previous empires worked. If you think of some of these previous ones, they recruited people from their subject peoples to be part of the imperial court, part of the imperial bureaucracy. Whoever had capacities that could serve this empire, they did so. That's not the case for the modern European nation state, settler colonial and colonial possessions. And so there's something different that happened that turned religious and cultural differences into racial division in order to subordinate and make more impermeable the boundary between the rulers and the ruled. And yet, at the same time, this kind of empire was never capable of totally dominating the rest of the world without recruiting collaborators, and others within its sort of system. And that's what gives us a sense of the way in which the current imperialist system is complex and involves recruiting, we could say, if we're thinking about what's happening right now, the Gulf states, the vassal states of the GCC are, basically incorporated into U.S. empire. They don't have sovereignty, they're subordinated, and it's a very different kind of situation than we saw in previous forms where conquest, enslavement, the use of violence, including genocidal violence, was organized in order to extract the labor and the resources of the colonized peoples of what we talk about now as the global south. I don't want to go, too much longer because that's already so much like history, and my colleagues actually will know a lot more about the functioning of the modern imperial, system. I just wanted to make a distinction, however, between older kinds of ideas of empire that sometimes are used in a very vicious sort of way to delegitimize indigenous populations, because maybe they learned to speak Arabic at some point in their history. Maybe they converted to Christianity at some point in their history. And maybe after that, many of them converted to Islam. And for some reason, this is characterized as Muslim imperialism, Muslim, empire and colonialism in order to re-indigenize a settler colonial population today by lumping together this idea of empire and imperialism as a trans-historical category. It's very important that we recognize that 500 years ago, with the establishment of the Atlantic world system, the nation-state colonizing empires I mentioned, and the primitive accumulation of that violence is what gives us our modern capitalist imperialist system. That is the fundamental contradiction we are living with today, and that helps clarify a lot of things, I think, in terms of the politics of the moment.
Thank you so much, Adnan, for that. I know that the questions that we provided you with, each one of you could provide a 2-hour lecture on any one of those questions. And so I think it's a big feat that you could answer that question in the time that you had, and I really appreciate you doing so. So thank you for that clarity. Ilan, if you want to take a stab at this question, we welcome you to.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Excellent, good. First of all, I'm very sorry not to be with you. I did all I could, but the airspace above my head is closed. Hopefully this airspace will not be invaded by a missile, so I don't have to leave you for a few minutes. And thank you for the organizers for a very crucial and important discussion. And I acknowledge the great contribution of the two other panelists. We already had a very good example of a very comprehensive analysis. I would like, therefore, to take kind of a different angle on that question and distinguish between imperialism in the modern era and imperialism in the more distant past, and more or less start with what Eric Hobsbawm used to call the age of imperialism. And because I do think that the origins of what we call today empire and our challenge, our attempt to challenge it, really go back to that kind of imperialism. And I do recognize that there are more than one variety of imperialism in different historical periods. But I think modern imperialism is the one that really emerged together with modernization, colonialism, capitalism, and the essence of it was, in many ways, a European conquest of the rest of the world for the sake of European economy, strategy, and sometimes implementation of European religious and later secular ideologies that justified taking over large parts of the world, whether through colonizing or through imperial methods that did not necessitate sending your own people to settle in the countries whose natural resources or their location you coveted. But I do think that something has changed dramatically in that kind of imperialism after the Second World War. Because the same continent, the same civilization, the same political outfit, if you want, that produced the modern imperialism that we talk about today, went through a very dramatic, I would say even traumatic period of extremism and violence at the heart of the empire, namely the two world wars in the heart of Europe. And there was a bit of a reaction to that for a moment dimmed, or at least even, I would say even genuinely, there was a wish to tame some of the imperialist drives, whether they were economic and capitalist, or strategic or ideological. Because this is the period, 1945 to 1948, that at the very heart where modern imperialism was born, also ideas of universalism are born, namely the Declaration of Human Rights, the establishment of the United Nations, the establishment of the international legal systems, and so on. And imperialism, very much like an amoeba, adapted itself for a while to a world order that came from the same origin that imperialism came from, that could have looked very critically and negatively at imperialism as such. And therefore, I think we have something we had before, but not on the same level, of clandestine imperialism, crypto-imperialism. Imperialism where you don't even send sometimes your army to make sure that a certain part, a certain country, a certain state is part of your empire. You sometimes do it by toppling those that reject your imperialism. And the Americans were very intensively involved in that kind of imperialism. So it has less of formal imperial institutions, but its mode of action was very much imperialist. The whole notion of a clear institution of a mother country, a center of an empire, vassals of an empire, and so on, I think was, as we move through the 20th century and 21st century, becomes less clear. But the mode of action of imperialism is still there. It just adapts to new technological realities, political realities, and other developments. And what is so interesting about history being cyclic rather than linear is that we might seem to, or it seems to me, we might go back to actually a more formal kind of imperialism, where you don't use clandestine crypto imperialism, you go back to actual territorial imperialism, actually conquering new lands, old lands, new lands, and so on, which is such a shock to the system that the Western imperial powers were trying to build in 1945, that the sense of disorientation in the world and the sense of going back to the same age of extremism or extreme that the West thought was behind it after the end of the Second World War, it really shatters the whole system. And I will end by saying that there's another way of looking at that transformation from a more formalistic, institutional to something far more ambivalent, and yet coming back to something more, something clearer, more institutionalized. There's another way of looking at it, and this is through global alliances that begin to form since 1945 until today. And these global alliances are like a kaleidoscope to my mind. They seem differently from different parts of the world, and I'll explain what I mean by this. You are either the receiving end of a very powerful global coalition that you can call imperialism, but it's not focused on one state. That global alliance that you are a victim of can consist of government, military industries, securitization industries, high-tech industry, even pharmaceutical industries, religious ideologies. It depends what kind of asset you are considered as a nation, as a country, as a region in a country, to global imperial coalition. Think about Israel. Israel is part of a global imperial coalition that does not only include the United States, it includes many states and many industries and many multinational corporations and even dimmer kind of outfits that make it a powerful global coalition. So either you are like the Palestinians at the receiving end of a global imperial coalition, and then you are looking, and I'm sure knowing from the question, and we'll talk about it later, how do you create a counter-global coalition? Because locally you can never defeat imperialism. Nobody can defeat imperialism of the 21st century. You could do it in the 20th century, but you can't do it in the 21st century locally. And you are facing both the front of that global imperialism. In the case of the Palestinians, it is Israel. In the case of native people around the world, it could be the settler colonial states. It varies, but someone is the front for the global coalition that is imperialist, and you are the anti-imperialist member of coalition that if you succeed in forming, you might succeed in confronting it. But as we can see, and I will end with an example, that when we put global Israel versus global Palestine, we can see what an anti-imperialist coalition looks like. It is based on civil society, with very few proper states being members of it. And that is a huge challenge given the potency of the global Israel coalition or any global imperial coalition we're facing.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilan. Patrick, as you're answering this question, I'm also going to ask if perhaps that you can take a moment to also situate us and who we, the people, are at this moment and where we're at also in the context of your
perspectives on how we identify empire at this time. Yeah.
Okay, good. First, I want to thank the organizers for bringing me here for this conversation. I really appreciate it. My co-panelists, Maysam as well. In terms of how we define imperialism, just to add on to Professor Pappé's very valuable response, in the 20th century, the competition between European colonial powers reached such a point that the entirety of the globe had essentially been conquered by a small group of powers, right? Portugal, France, England, so on. And when I speak of the emergence of imperialism as a modern phenomenon in the 20th century, I think about this, that there was nowhere else for these powers to go, and thus these powers went to war with each other, what we call inter-imperialist conflict. And then through those wars, there was a carve-up of zones of influence throughout the rest of the world for control over everything from natural resources and the decision-making over who gets the profit from either getting those natural resources or the manufacture of those resources, the say in who gets to control trade routes. All of this was the spoils of division of the First World War. This is what Lenin wrote about in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which is something that I think in study groups people should get together and debate. Professor Pappé spoke about 1945. I think there are a few major changes since 1945, which is that the head of the imperialist world system has changed. Unquestionably, 1945 and afterwards, the United States, I think, subordinated imperial competitors, such as England, France, Germany, so on and so forth, under its aegis and its leadership in a way that we hadn't really seen an imperial power take control of the global stage in history. So that's one major change. Second major change we have to keep in mind, and this will lead me to the part of where we place ourselves, is that after 1945, there was a sustained, consistent challenge to imperial rule from the colonies in the form of the national liberation movements. Now, why do I refer to the anti-colonial movements after World War II as the national liberation movements? I'm referring to the struggle of peoples in the former colonies to gain control over their mode of productions. So those things that I was talking about in terms of routes, in terms of natural resources, in terms of their own people, that is what kind of labor they perform and on what terms. And then also control over their culture. A lot of times this is a reclamation of culture. As we see in examples like Algeria, where they try to tell the population they're an extension of France, or in Ireland, where they go to tell the population you're an extension of England, and so on, okay? So by the time we reach the 21st century, after the systemic change, I think that now we have to reckon with the fact that, particularly after 1991, when we see the overthrow of the Soviet Union, this was a major base of support for national liberation movements against US-led imperialism. That what we see now is that the struggle for national liberation might include that of a stateless people trying to reclaim their land, like Palestinians are. And it might also include a state that had achieved formal sovereignty during the era of the national liberation struggles in the 20th century, trying to fight off attempts at recolonization, often led by the United States. Recolonization the United States has a series of means by which it tries to achieve this through state collapse of these institutions that emerged out of the national liberation struggles. Hybrid attacks can include direct warfare. It includes economic warfare in the form of sanctions. It includes cyber warfare. It includes propaganda warfare and psychological operations of this sort, all sorts of means to collapse a state and recolonize, okay? We've seen many examples of this in the past 20 years. And so what this teaches us, and I think this goes back to, I'm gonna recommend, some of you have probably read Cabral, C-A-B-R-A-L. Read National Liberation and Culture in your reading groups. What he taught us in that is that after a state achieves formal sovereignty, the struggle for national liberation is not over, as we see in Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran right now. I mean, Iran is fighting for control over a waterway that is on its physical land border against what? The United States is all the way over here in North America. So these are the things that we want to keep in mind when we situate ourselves in the current struggle against imperialism in the 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you all three for the clarity and not only that, but situating us in particular historic moments in time that we should be thinking about, that we should be studying. I saw folks taking notes rigorously and perhaps thinking about planning those reading groups that you suggested, Patrick, and thinking about how we respond to not only the expansion of imperialist forces, but the ways in which imperialist forces destabilize internally, as we see attempts at in places like Lebanon and like Iran, in order to expand a wider project, which I know we will be talking about today. And moving kind of to our next section of discussion, we're going to focus on resistance, resistance to empire, and particularly, I'm going to throw this back to you, Patrick, thinking in the context of Palestinian anti-imperialist and resistance lineage and how it's shaped broader regional dynamics. How can we root ourselves in that lineage while also understanding, in order to help us understand the particular moment that we're in when it comes to what the region is facing today, right? How has Palestinian resistance and anti-imperialist history and realities influenced not only what we're seeing in terms of the war in Iran, but also this recent escalation in Lebanon? And could you also clarify for us what are the interests of empire at this time in the region?
That's a very good question. When I spend a lot of time, my research time is dedicated to examining the history of Palestinian Arab resistance, national liberation movement, how they conceptualized imperialism, and what the strategies they developed in order to fight against it. And I will say that historically, the Palestinian cause, that is after, particularly after 1948, but even before that in many ways, the Palestinian cause was situated as one front within a larger Arab cause. So the Palestinian cause was specifically for two things: the liberation of the Palestinian people and the return to the land, okay? Situated within a broader Arab cause that was nationalist in nature and was seeking to reunite territories that had been severed by England and France, the creation of these colonial borders. In 1916, this is summarized as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So this means that during this period of the 1940s, the 1950s, 60s, and so on, the Palestinians relied on a broader depth of Arab nationalist support, okay, with all of its attendant complications, but nonetheless was there. We've seen an aggressive US and Zionist-led attack, counterinsurgency campaign against this project over several decades, okay? And so a lot of the basis of support, including especially state support for that project, were destroyed in major wars. We can go 1967, we can go thereafter on the list, okay? This being said, when I do study this history of Palestinian Arab resistance, I am drawn to a certain sense of revolutionary optimism, okay? And people know what I mean by revolutionary optimism, which is a form of optimism that is not delusional, but rather realistic because it's based on a it's much longer timeline than the quick turnaround of the headlines. So this is what I say when some people are like, how can you be optimistic? Don't you see the disaster that imperialism is creating? It's destroying entire nation states. Here's why I feel that way. Because when I see the organization and the strategies of Palestinian resistance today, I see an improvement upon many strategies that were created decades earlier, but they didn't yet have the means to execute them, meaning you see trial and error, okay? I mean, there are many different ways that we can approach it, but I'll give you just an example on as far as the military situation, the military relationship between United States-led imperialism, Zionism on one side, and the resistance project in the region. The gap of asymmetry has narrowed a bit from the past. And that is because everything that is being deployed against US imperialism militarily is based on lessons that have accrued from past experiences. And I can give you many such examples. I'll just leave it at two. One, the Yemeni resistance, their deployment of drones, which they make very cheaply, they are able to execute what Palestinian resistance in the 1970s would call external operations carried out to create problems for reproduction, sites of reproduction of imperialism, okay? In order to carry out an operation like that in the 1970s, you would need to recruit a few people, a few commandos, and it would be basically a suicide mission. You knew that you were going to lose these people. Nowadays, there's been a reverse engineering of the imperialist technology in such a way that allows people to actually commit what was envisioned from far away in terms of something that's easily and cheaply reproduced, okay? And I could go through a whole list of examples, you know, the strategy of the Lebanese resistance in basically creating an economic crisis in the north of occupied Palestine. This started out back in the 1960s when Palestinian factions that were mainly of the left back then, now it's Islamic resistance, but they're incorporating the same lessons because back then they had just a few of these Katyusha rockets and then they were out of their supply, right? So this is the timeline that I need us to think on. Think in terms of decades because history is seismic and it moves only under pressure from untold millions of people. Okay.
Patrick. We're going to move to Adnan to provide us with, in thinking about the resistance history in the region, oftentimes we hear sentiments among the quote-unquote Western left that have critiqued Islamic resistance over time. And so I think with the moment that we're in, we can no longer deny the integral role of Islamic resistance in playing a fight against imperialism, particularly in the region. And so in thinking with Patrick's points that was just shared, can you help us demystify the reality of the character of Islamic resistance in the region, perhaps prior to this moment, but also in the contemporary of where we're sitting right now? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, that's a really important topic in terms of solidarity in the moment that we're in and how we go forward and struggle. And I think some of the roots of the explanation are actually in what Patrick just was detailing about the nature of resistance that was developed principally by kind of more Marxist, leftist resistance factions, say in Palestine and elsewhere, that those techniques have been carried forward, developed, and there is something that has to be acknowledged and recognized as a kind of continuity of resistance. And in fact, actually, it kind of reminds me of a really interesting remark that I heard I don't know who it was, but an Iraqi intellectual figure on an Iraqi program not too long ago who was telling about his experience traveling to Egypt and being detained by security in Cairo airport because he was from Iraq. They said, "Oh, are you Shia?" And he said to them, "Brother, this is such an old question, an old problem. That's 50, 60 years. We should be finished with this. There are only two schools now, two madhahib, two orientations religiously or politically, etc. There's the, madrasat al-muqawama, and there's the madrasat al-inbitah. Okay, so there's just, the school of resistance versus the school of subservience or prostration. And each side has, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Sunni, Shia, on both sides. The real question is, which side are you on? And now is a time of decision. And we have to cut through a lot of the propaganda that wants to confuse us around some of these projections of identity, both within, I would say, this is my critique, within the Muslim kind of community, particularly in the diaspora. And we'll talk about the diaspora maybe if we get a chance, is this continuing of sectarianism, and there's also sectarianism or an allergic reaction to Islamic resistance in some quarters of the left. If we don't recognize what the fundamental problem is of, are you going to resist empire? Or are you going to be subservient and surrender to it and collaborate with it? Then you can get caught up in a lot of these other sorts of issues. But that should be a kind of clarifying point, it seems to me, because what we are seeing right now is something of potentially world historical significance. Patrick, and I'm just so much appreciating being on a panel with other historians. I just love discussing history and how it's relevant to our contemporary moment. But that Sykes-Picot, that's up for grabs now. That's what we're seeing. Is it going to be greater Israel, or is it going to be the decolonization of West Asia? In some ways, I think of it also, is Iran kind of opening up the possibility right now for a second wave of the revolution in different forms and in different, kind of figure. We see what's happening with the resistance there is that people in Iranian society are being re-inspired by their confrontation, their resistance to empire, with a genuinely revolutionary spirit that I think we haven't seen something like that for a long time. And it happens to have taken and draw from theological and religious vocabulary, but what it is and it would just express itself in other forms and other vocabulary and language in different cultural contexts. What it is this resistant, revolutionary, defiant spirit. And I think we have to overcome some of the hang-ups that we've had on the left, some of the frankly Islamophobic kinds of, perspectives that tries to, isolate us from real identification with the madrasat al-muqawama. Whatever shape or form it is taking, we need to be part of the madhab, the school, the orientation of resistance. So one could talk a lot about it, and I'd love to talk about Shi'i martyrology and how much is it theology versus history. I'm a historian. I think that the theology is adaptive to the historical conditions, and we could talk about it. But clearly, we are witnessing revolutionary activity, and we should stand with those who are fighting the empire.
Perhaps, Adnan, we can consider starting a third podcast titled Madrasa al-Muqawama, inshallah.
A great idea.
Thank you so much for that. Ilan, I would love to hear your thoughts on what's happening internally right now in the Zionist entity. I know that for those of us who are watching the news, who are keeping up with the kinds of gains, military gains of the resistance right now in the region, we know that the Zionist entity in the US the U.S. are lying, about some of the level of damage that they're experiencing right now in the face of the military response from Iran and from various resistance factions in the region. Could you provide us with an eternal assessment of the entity's current state? And also, in doing so, can you clarify perhaps the aspirations that we're hearing time and time again in the news, that Naftali Bennett recently made a statement that Turkey is going to be the new Iran, quote unquote. And so what does this tell us about what we've always known about the nature of Zionism, perhaps this quote unquote greater Israel project?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the first question. In terms of casualties, for instance, if you only look at the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's very minimal in terms of how many people were killed. Also in terms, I would say, of damage compared, for instance, to the previous exchange. But I think that's not the right way of looking at it. I think if you want to understand how serious this resistance to Israel, whether it comes from Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, or from the Houthis in Yemen, you have to look at it in a much wider context. The state of Israel, since its inception in 1948, had never been in a war that continued for such a long time. This war started on the 7th of October, 2023, this particular war. It didn't start when the United States and Israel assaulted Iran. Now, Israel has, as a society and as a state, as the Jewish society in particular, has never experienced such a duration, such a long duration. And therefore, I think that the impact is less in the number of institutions that were hit, the number of people who were killed, but far more a blow to the foundation of the state that already had very extensive cracks in it before the 7th of October. And I think that's how one should analyze what goes on in Israel. And I agree with Patrick. This is about, if you might call it revolutionary optimism or imagination, it doesn't matter. This is about the long-term impact, which we will not see in the next 2 or 3 years. Whatever we are discussing on this platform here is not, we cannot bring any fantastic news to the people of Gaza or the West Bank for 27 or 28. Let's be honest and realistic about it. But I think we are in a process of seeing the end of the Zionist project, or the beginning of the end of the Zionist project, which unfortunately can go through a very brutal and a very severe period of inhumanity, as has happened to some of similar regimes that eventually collapsed in the past. So the extensive cracks are in the social cohesion of the Jewish society, in the exhaustion of the military capabilities, in the war economy that is being, unless there would be a huge financial aid from the United States, would not be sustainable. And not to add to this, of course, the already pariah status of Israel in the global civil society, even if it has not as yet reached governments and elites, and the dramatic changes in the younger Jewish communities around the world none of these discrete cracks, if you want, by itself brings down a structure such as Zionism. But when they are all simultaneously working, each with its own pace, there is a moment in history, and we know it as historians, when these kind of discrete processes fuse together into a very explosive and transformative moment. And I don't think we are that far from that moment, but I'm an historian. So when I'm saying not far, I don't mean in 2 or 3 years. I'm talking about far longer. Now, for your second question, I think it's important to a little bit unpack the current Israeli ideological and political elite, and it's, I'm not sure you can even call it strategy, but it's kind of impulse in what it is doing, both in historical Palestine itself and in the neighboring Arab countries and in Iran as well. First of all, you have here a coalition that at the top of it is someone with no ideological vision. Benjamin Netanyahu. He doesn't have an ideology or ideological outlook. He is only concerned in staying in power. And everything that he's doing, and there's very little limit to what he's willing to do for that, is in order to stay in power. But it is his allies in the coalition who are far more messianic and ideological. And the way they see it is that there is, according to their understanding, a historical window that allows them, without any inhibitions, to try and ethnically cleanse many, many more Palestinians than ever the Zionist movement was able and capable of doing before, in creating Israel as a kind of recreating a biblical Israel that is both feared and respected in the region, that geographically has to extend far beyond the boundaries of historical Palestine. You know, Israelis 50 or 60 years ago were aware of this kind of ideological ideas, but they seem to be on the margins. And most people thought that these are the more lunatic margins of Zionism. But now they are the mainstream. They are the hegemonic ideology. To that, you can add the military industry. Every such show of display of cutting-edge military technology increases dramatically the profits of the Israeli military industry. And the army itself, that has been, anyway, overtaken by the kind of mixture of Messianic Zionism, Jewish racism, and that has both secular and religious foundation to that. So I think this is so far a coalition that needs, some of it needs a war even without winning a war, as long as, for example, in the case of Netanyahu, it goes until the elections in the fall of 2026. Others would, I think, totally depend on the global and regional coalition to sustain them. Namely, do they read correctly President Trump as an ideological partner, not just as a strategic partner? Do they read correctly the influence of Christian Zionists on American policy, and therefore they share the kind of sense of the historical moment they are in it? Do they read correctly the continued willingness of Arab regime to normalize the colonization of Palestine and the dispossession of the Palestinians? So in history, and I think all of us historians would agree, it does not always, all of it matters what you are doing. A lot matters what others are doing while you do what you do. Namely, in kind of a final sentence, I would say, I don't think they would succeed at all in creating this greater Israel. I don't succeed that they. I don't think that they will. I believe that they won't succeed in depopulating historical Palestine to the level that they want to depopulate it. They haven't succeeded in doing it until now, and I don't think they will succeed in doing it. As an activist and someone who's very close to the Palestinians who live in Palestine, not those who live outside of Palestine, those who live in Palestine, I have never been as worried as I am now about their life, well-being, and survival in the next 2 years. Not in the sense that they will disappear. They will never disappear, and they will win eventually. But they are facing the most ruthless, I think, Israel that they've ever faced before, even more ruthless and inhuman than they faced in 1948. And we, of course, this comes to the realm of activism and not scholarship. While strategizing, of course, for the future, we still haven't found the formula to deal with urgency for the people of Palestine on the ground that every day now are being killed, wounded, and dispossessed while we have these meetings in Toronto and other places. The question is, we are definitely on the right course historically, I have no doubt about it, in terms of liberation and freedom for the Palestinians. But we are in a station that is the worst station in the history of the Palestinians. How do we shorten our stay in that station is, to my mind, the biggest challenge we haven't yet been able to face properly.
Thank you, Ilan. I think in response to that sobering reminder of where we're at in the region and for Palestinians, for our people, I think I want to ask you, and first off, I just want to check in with the organizers about how much time we have left for this panel. 5 minutes? Okay, so I think we're gonna jump to this question. We wanted to have a conversation a bit about exploring this idea of counterinsurgency and counterinsurgent tactics, not only in the material sense or the military sense of it, but also on the level of public narrative when it comes to diaspora, the role of the diaspora, the shifting relationship between the US and the Zionist entity as a result of kind of them losing this battle in terms of the narrative on a global scale. And so I think what I'm gonna ask the three of you to do is kind of provide us with some concluding thoughts today, with folks here we're thinking with our people here in Toronto, Palestinians in the diaspora, but remembering that sobering reminder that you gave us, Ilan. How can we ensure that we are remaining as sharp as possible in our analysis of what is happening in the moment as we continue to organize for not only the liberation of Palestine, but also the liberation of all oppressed peoples around the globe? Perhaps I can throw it back to you, Ilan, if there are reflections that you are having from being there, from being on the ground, a message that you'd like to share with us here in Toronto today.
Yeah, and I understand we have only 5 minutes, so it will be a soundbite. I apologize, but I want to give enough time to the other two panelists. I think, first of all, we do need, despite all the difficulties that the Palestinians on the ground are experiencing, we still need a movement of unity on the Palestinian side, one that could push forward the ideas that were at the heart of the national liberation movement, such as the one democratic state from the river to the sea, jettisoning the whole discussion of the two-state solution, putting a real counter-narrative to the narrative of the day after and the so-called peace process. I think this is something that is possible even in the worst kind of moment of oppression and dispossession. Secondly, I do believe that there was something of a rainbow coalition that was very powerful in places such as London and Rome when 1 million people demonstrated for Palestine. And what was remarkable about those 1 million people, that they were not only sharing a commitment, they were also pragmatic. They created a coalition that was not purist. And I think the left is still needs to get over its purism in order to extend the coalition that needs, at least urgently, to save the Palestinians. Then you can have a much more focused alliance, if you want, for building the future. But these are very two different coalitions, and you have to dirty your hands if you want to save people, and you cannot be purist. Thirdly, let's continue to disrupt the narrative in your universities in Canada, in your media. Let's not allow the wrong language, the wrong vocabulary to be used. Let's not allow the propaganda of what happened and why happened, what happened on the 7th of October and after occurred. Let's make sure that in our campuses, high school, and media, not only alternative media, we continue to insist that there is a narrative that is as cruel and as inhuman as the actions of Israel on the ground. Thank you.
Those were excellent suggestions and key points to continue to keep in mind. You know, when I think of this question, what could we do, what should we be doing to be engaged in this struggle, to be members of, you know, the school of resistance, wherever we are, however we can, sometimes I feel a little overwhelmed and depressed by the sense of having failed, that we have failed the people of Palestine. We didn't stop this genocide here in the imperial core. Some of those amazing demonstrations, you know, prove that there is solidarity and higher consciousness that has been developed, but it has also exposed that we don't live in democracies where the will of the people is reflected in the institutions of our governance. And we have to continue to demonstrate and to rally and to educate and so on. But it seems like we also have to become sharper and smarter about how we engage in our resistance. And, you know, one thing I would say is we're learning, actually, if we map out what has been the targets of Iran's resistance against the empire, they have exposed a lot of the places of weakness, you know, and so on. If you think about it, we had the previous panel about the AI and surveillance, the data centers that are there in the Gulf. You know, they have targeted those, the financial institutions that support and kind of make those Gulf countries exist by being a place for circulating all of this ill-gotten capital. You know, there's like, they have shown, and in some ways, it means that we might need to sharpen our focus, what we can do in the imperial core to put pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, you know, like Palestine Action in the UK has done. I mean, direct action as a tool is something to develop. It doesn't mean that all of us individually, you may not feel capable of doing that. But for every actionist, there are 10 people who have to be part of the, you know, narrative war, the support services, the fundraising, etc. We need to organize and think of ourselves as the support front, you know, and there's so much more that we could do. And also, I remember, you know, the fact that we also had an earlier panel about what's happening here in this country in Turtle Island. We would not have a nation and a state here that was complicit in the slaughter and murder of Palestinians, in genocide in Gaza, in Palestine. We would not have a country that was supporting imperialist war against Iran for having expressed solidarity with the people of Palestine if we had decolonized our land and our country. So we have work to do that can contribute to being part of what Abu Ubaidah, the martyr, said, called us all and made the appeal to the free peoples of the world. Are we going to be among those free peoples of the world? We have a lot that we can do right here. So join these organizations. Take your understanding of resistance from those who are resisting. They're showing us the way. And always follow the 8 rules of the martyr Basil al-Arash when you're engaging in the information war and disrupting the narrative. Don't repeat, the talking points of the enemy. I mean, we have to become a little smarter and more disciplined. Even here in the imperial core, there's so much we could do to contribute to the liberation of Palestine, to the liberation of peoples across the world, and the liberation of ourselves.
A few things that are on my mind as we enter this historical moment. First, never assume our class enemy is stupid, okay? They might be stupid about certain things. They don't care about philosophy, art. They don't care about what it is to be humane. This is a certain type of stupidity. This is true. But trust them to know their class interests and trust them to know how to secure them. So that's why we take them seriously. Number 2, we rise above petty resentments to focus on principles rather than personalities. We all have beefs in the movement, so we all have people that we can't stand. We look at them, we have a visceral reaction because of the past or whatever. We have to rise above that to ask ourselves, is this a personal beef or is this a political a matter of principle? Number 3, don't assume state institutions in the US and Canada are going to support anti-imperialism short of revolution. That's why we create our own institutions. The universities are run by these Epsteinites. They're run by the Epstein class, as Adnan said. So we have to remember that we're going to have to construct our own institutions. And finally, the United States empire is moving from this rapidly, as Professor Pappé was describing, from this position of ideological hegemony to repression and also towards territorial direct control. This is a sign of structural weakness rather than strength because the one who drops the bomb is hated. And in some ways, the United States during the Gaza genocide and the Biden administration, they would even, I think, hide behind Israel for their real motives. We're trying to stop them. We're trying to stop them. So as they come out of the shadows and they try to take control of territory directly, we take advantage of the delegitimization of our class enemy. And we do this by also taking the lead of the narrative. A lot of people in North America, in the United States and Canada, their understanding or explanation for what's going on is going to be cast in, especially in the United States, American nationalist terms, right? The United States has been, they're doing something for Israel that is against the US imperial interests and so on and so forth. We have to assume responsibility for an explanation because that explanation does not help Cuba, for instance, as it comes under a direct attack from the United States. And if Cuba falls, Palestine is made weaker. So that is the strategic question that's at stake in the explanation and analysis we offer. And we have to take a vanguard role and assume responsibility for explaining this to people. Thank you.
That's it, folks. We're over time, so we're going to close it there. And thank you so much for that. Thank you. Thank you so much.